So if everybody's in place, we can start this panel. Right, so this is the first time we have done something like this. This is a Journal of Learning Analytics panel, but it's bringing in everybody who's here. It's bringing in the readership of the JLA more generally, because actually we're following Ken's advice. We're making the journal not just a read-only thing, it's something that you can get more involved in contributing to. Because this team here have prompted us to start a new section in the Journal of Learning Analytics, which is the Open Peer Commentary section. So for you very dedicated readers of the journal, you may remember that a few years back, Simon Buckingham-Shum led something a bit like this, in that he asked Neil Selwyn to write up his keynote from LAK in the journal, and then asked some people to respond to that keynote. We're now making this a sort of regular section of the journal. We formalised it a little bit more. So there is a paper which has been written. The paper is up on the journal website under early access now, so all of you can read it. But if you don't want to read it at this moment, we've got people to talk you through it. So once again, following Ken's advice about learning here. And the idea is it's gone up early access with some light touch peer reviewing, that the community reads it because it's a subject of interest to the community, and that if you're interested in responding to it in the journal, you come back to us just with a short proposal saying, these are the people who'd like to author the response, this is the aspect we'd like to respond to. So you've got a month after LAK to come back to us with a proposal. And if we take up your proposal, we can have up to 10 commentaries. Your commentary would appear with the main paper in the August edition of the journal. So to get you ready for that, and to get everybody in the community ready for that, we've got a panel here. Not all the authors of the paper were able to make it to LAK, and probably you wouldn't have wanted to hear from all 9 of them, I would think. But we've got Charles Lang here to talk to us. We've got Geraldine Gray, we've got Josh Quick, and we've got Chris Brooks. Now you may be wondering what Linda Corrin is doing at the end there, in that case. We have invited Linda to respond and to ask some questions of the authors and to give you ideas about some of the things that might be picked up on. And then we're going to open it up to people here, people who are joining us virtually, to raise some questions. And we're hoping that the discussion will go on because we think this is really of pressing interest for the community. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pass over to Charles, and he's going to give the first bit of the presentation.
Untrue. Geraldine is going to give the first bit, and I'm just doing the slides. So you can stay with that.
So as Rebecca was saying, there are 9 authors of this paper. 4 of us could make it to LAK, but particularly I want to shout out to Ben Motes, who did a lot of the heavy lifting on this work, and the very upbeat cajoling of the 9 of us just to keep us on target and get the job done. And there's a URL up there quickly that you can download the paper. So what did we do? Everybody will know our definition of learning analytics. Has anybody in the room not cited that at some point in their publications? Show of hands. No, so we know what it is we're about, and it's a fairly easily understandable goal. We're looking at learning data in a learning context, and what we're trying to do is understand learning and optimize learning. That's our goal. And there's been lots of murmurings amongst the community right from the start, wondering, are we actually achieving that goal or not? And Doug Clough had a very nice analogy very early on in the history of LAK, calling us a jackdaw field of inquiry. So we take the nice new methods and models and the easy accessible data, and we run our models and find a significant p-value, and out pops the result. But are we actually doing what we said we do? Dragon was prompted in 2015 to tell us, guys, this is actually supposed to be about learning. And Alyssa Wise that same year and David Schaefer in an editorial in the JLA asked us to bring in more learning theories into what we were doing. That's 8 years ago, and I think if they published that today, it would probably still be a valid request, because we don't really have an epistemology for learning analytics. Rebecca in 2017 talked about a lack of practical evidence that what we're doing has impact. And if anyone here has had the unenviable task of trying to persuade their institutions to invest in the infrastructure and the personnel and the resources and the process change to bring learning analytics into their institution, you get to that bit that says return on investment, and it's actually, it's very hard to fill out because the evidence isn't there. Or so we've been talking about that with each other in the community. Shane Dawson in 2019 described us having an awful lot of niche papers. So we're taking our own data and doing something nice with them, but it's not generalizable. We all know that one model fits all. So we set about thinking, can we get empirical evidence that this is the case, that as a community, are we or are we not achieving our goal of understanding learning? So that's what this paper is about. And before I hand you over to Josh, who's going to tell you about how we did that, we have one disclaimer. So you'll know from Ken's talk earlier, he gave a sneak preview of some of our results. It's not pleasant reading. It's certainly not particularly complimentary of us. But we just want to say all of the papers that we analysed, we were also authors of some of those papers. We also failed the bar that was set in this piece of work for what constitutes good research in learning analytics.
So to start with, maybe just to back up and say the original motivations of this paper was actually to examine the extent to which open practices had been adopted by the learning analytics community.
Just to have both.
Just to double up, okay. What we eventually shifted towards in the broader term was to, partially because we were not observing any direct measure of learning broadly defined. So to sort of broaden our scope, we looked at LAK papers from 2020 and 2021 initially as part of our first wave. That incorporated about 6 authors reading through and coding across several dimensions, some of which were largely descriptive, like where was the study done, how many participants occurred within it, what was the questions of the study if they had. If we could not infer that information, or if that information was not present, we did our best to infer it from how the paper was written. And then we also qualitatively coded across 4 dimensions. Was the study primarily qualitative? Did it try to offer rich descriptions or changes? Did it measure an authentic learning environment, be it a class, an informal context, museum, any kind of space such as that? This excluded things like laboratory experiments and things of that nature. Second, learning outcomes was our sort of main focus, and that's broadly construed as we could make it. It could include an individual assessment, such as an exam, a formative assessment like a small quiz or things of that nature. But also we were trying to be as open as possible, and it could be any representation or artifact like an essay the student writes, as well as online talk or discourse that they have. So anything of that nature that was measured and provided a rich description of how the student might have learned or how people might have learned in that context was deemed as an outcome of learning. And finally, did they intervene in the learning environment? Based upon what either finding or how they developed it, did they do something different? Did they make a recommendation or a change? And what was the result of that change, if so? So as you can see, coding occurred in 2 waves. As I previously mentioned, LAK 2021 and 151. We had pretty good agreement with that at a cap of 0.9. Then we expanded it out to JLA and LAK 2022 through JLA 2020 and 2022. And we had a little bit more disagreement because that was mostly done by 2 coders. And the biggest source of disagreement there was whether a study was qualitative or not, and we kind of advised caution in that term. And lastly, everything is available on OSF. So if you go to that link, you can find our codes, you can find what we wrote about, and you can comment on them directly. And it's Charles, right?
Yes.
Next.
That's me. Okay.
I pass you the
baton. Okay, so my job is to be scooped by Ken. That you've already seen this once, so we can talk about it a little bit briefer, I suppose. So here's some kind of interesting general stats about the papers. So 75% of the papers described a student sample, and 40% described a course sample, so there's like overlap there. And then 26% of them had samples of over 1,000, so that's our kind of MOOC contingent. The kind of modal sample was a single course with about 300 students in it, so we'll talk a little bit about what that might mean later. Now here's the big findings, which is that 63% of the analyzed data from students, oh, whoops, no, there's more background, sorry. Oh yeah, because we made this, I got chastised for putting too many points on a slide. So now there's fewer points per slide. So 63% of the analyzed data from students was in an authentic learning environment, as Josh said. And we think about 20% are qualitative, but again, as Josh said, you know, buyer beware a little bit on that, because there was quite a bit of disagreement on what qualitative meant. Now, here's the big one. The big one is 71% of the articles do not measure any kind of learning outcome as we defined it. So there is some room for discussion there, certainly, and hopefully we encourage you all to raise points after this. And then 89% of the papers had no kind of intervention. So those are the 2 big ones, and now I think I'm going to hand over to Chris.
Thank you. So I think Joshua said something about the motivations, and there's many motivations because there's 9 of us to start with, but also within us. And one of my motivations as we engaged in this work was I was sick of complaining to colleagues that my paper was rejected because it's not learning analytics. And I'm like, but we every year write something about definitions of what is learning analytics. I did an experiment. I had 2 different conditions. It was about learning. I used data. Where am I falling flat? And of course, I think lots of people in this room have had that kind of review come back. And I think that that's not super healthy for us 10 years into our field. So a couple of discussion points I'd love to see raised. I'd love to see brought up in commentary. I mean, we haven't had letters to the editor in a long time, but they used to be. I used to really enjoy reading them as a grad student, actually, for journals. So one is misalignment. We define ourselves as having learning-oriented goals, but our research is not actually always investigating this with the learning-oriented outcomes. So is that a problem? I mean, sometimes it's things we believe strongly are determinants of learning. Is that enough? Is that a reasonable thing to be included? Or do you have to have some measurement of a learning outcome? Convenience. This is a very hard one. There's a lot of examples, if you go back through our proceedings, of testing something in a single class. Sometimes there's a statement about whether one of the authors was the instructor of the class or not, but we don't typically require or encourage even positionality statements. When we start thinking about the lasting impact of our work versus just the next conference pub, are we actually going to move the needle if we can't generalize, or if not generalize, more tightly articulate when a given effect, theory, and so forth holds, and for what kind of population? And then interventions. There's actually quite a bit of non-intervention work being done within LAK. And this isn't just about RCTs. I do a lot of randomized control trial work, but I don't think that you need to do randomized control trials to measure the effects of an intervention. There's a lot of, you can have qualitative interviews, for instance. You can use focus groups. There's a lot of different methodologies that we adopt within learning analytics. We do talk about optimization a lot. My work talks about optimization a lot with predictive models, but often that's not tied back to learning. And if that's what our definition is about, how do we deal with that lack of alignment? And I'll pass it over here to you, Linda.
Thank you. Sorry, I thought they were all going to talk again. I thought I had heaps of time to think this through. All right. So firstly, thank you to the authors for inviting me along to talk about this. I got the paper a few days ago and I've read it through a couple of times, more times than Chris has in the last week apparently, but that's another story. And what I want to say, I mean, there's lots of things I want to say and I don't want to go for too long, but the paper was really thought-provoking because the numbers got me first. So I sort of thought, wow, that's really surprising that, you know, that such a large proportion of the research out there doesn't really address what the authors have defined as learning outcomes. And so I thought about my own work, and I challenge you all in the room right now to think about it. So I actually haven't published in JLA or LAK for the last 2 or 3 years, so I'm not in the sample. However, if I was to think back across all the work I've done in learning analytics, I wouldn't, you know, I'd be one of those statistics that doesn't focus on learning outcomes. So think about your own work. Does the work that you're doing, have you included some kind of, and the definition I think you guys used was, you know, some sort of assessment, quiz, test, that sort of thing as a measure of learning. So, and then I thought, well, and of course they said, well, you could be a bit provocative. And I like the fact they're being provocative in actually putting this paper out there and giving us an opportunity to think about it. And I thought, well, the field is diverse, and they've mentioned earlier in the paper that, you know, it's a complex field, it's interdisciplinary, we've come from many different perspectives to get to this point. But there's a lot that we do in the learning analytics field that maybe doesn't need to look at learning outcomes. So we've got a huge thing, you know, the trustworthiness of the theme of this conference around the ethics that we do. So we don't need learning outcomes to be looked at in those sorts of studies, but we do need to look at how we use learning analytics so that it's not doing harm to our students, to ourselves and to our institutions. We've got a lot of work that's all about the sort of implementation of learning analytics in institutions, which is also interesting work, but won't necessarily pull learning outcome data into the conversation. Or maybe it should, I don't know. And maybe that's a question for the authors in a moment too. So I think I wouldn't want to put it all down to a number. I don't think we need 100% of learning analytics thing, and I don't think that's obviously what the authors are arguing either. But so we do need to think about the field as a holistic thing. One of the provocations that the authors put forward is, do we need to rethink some of the definitions around what we talk about as learning analytics research? And I'm going to come back to that at the end. But there was a couple of things that I thought that maybe weren't, some were touched on in the paper, but were maybe some of the reasons why these numbers are as they are. So when I look at my own institution and I look at how people research their teaching, so I work in a role where I actually need to encourage SOTL, so the Scholarship of Learning and Teaching, and there's a few things that really make that difficult. So the first is getting funding and support to do the research in the first place. So a lot of us don't have good access to research funding. Some of us, and I'm very jealous of some of you Americans in the room, have really great, national groups that you can get money from, but a lot of us are really struggling. So we're doing things at a small scale. So I wonder if that's possibly why we're not seeing some of the initial studies that we're doing being translated into the interventions that we want to see ultimately. So that's sort of one thing. And of course the other thing is we do studies, and we've all been guilty of this, I'm sure. We do studies to a certain point, we find something really interesting, we have a proof of concept, and then we think, oh, we'd love to be able to take this into an authentic learning environment and see how it goes, but our funding runs out. and we have to move on to the next project. So I know Simon and I were on a panel many years ago for an Australasian lassie where we talked about this very thing, about how funding models really do sometimes constrain the sort of work we want to do. Longitudinal studies are really difficult to get off the ground, and yet wouldn't it be great if we had more longitudinal studies in learning analytics research? So I think that's one of the things. Something I came across last week in a conversation I was having with a colleague was, I don't know what I'm teaching until next week. And then I've only got 3 weeks before the semester starts to be able to do something. So trying to plan your research ahead, trying to get ethics to be able to do research studies. And so that means a lot of people can't do that applied research. They can't be looking at what their students are doing in particular. So they do try and do something a bit more conceptual, or, so there's those sorts of kind of infrastructure, or not infrastructure, but sort of the ways that we work in terms of our research that really does constrain some of what we would really love to do. We have a huge research student community in LAK, which I think is absolutely wonderful. But again, they're constrained by time. They have, as long as they're working on their thesis, and then it becomes the job hunt and where do I go next? And of course, some people who are doing some really interesting stuff in this area have to stop that work and move on to something else because their employment demands it. So there's lots of those sorts of things that I think are out there, and I don't know what Solar is going to do about that per se. I'd be really interested to hear what the authors think we could do about that. But yeah, so some of these kinds of constraints perhaps are contributing to what we're seeing here in the numbers as well. The other thing that the authors did talk about in the paper was also the publishing thing. So of course, Rebecca's coming from JLA. This is all prompted by a publishing motivation, I guess, in some ways, and trying to get people to talk about these things more openly. But also the way that we publish and what we need to do to get our work published sometimes can also impact that. So I'm not going to go into that in any great detail, and I hope maybe some of the questions from the audience will open that up a little bit later on. So I think, sustainability of funding for research, as I said, how it's published. I really liked there was something that the author said really early on in the paper, which was that scholarship within learning analytics concerns itself more with the demonstration of methods than with the purpose of the methods. And I thought that was a really nice sentence, and that was sort of my starting point for thinking about what I wanted to talk about here. Because when I look at learning analytics and we look at kind of all the different levels of learning analytics, we've got those really niche tools and approaches that we've seen a lot of in the last couple of days. Ken showed us some really great stuff this morning, looking at particular activities and the effect of those on student learning. But a lot of what our institutions are doing are at that big level. We're building generic dashboards, we're putting in reporting systems, and we don't often research those in the same way that we research the more niche things. So again, when we're talking about trying to take this work to the implementation and the intervention stage, I think there's an awful lot of work that we could be doing with some of our bigger institutional systems that I think is a little bit missing from our literature. I don't know whether people would agree with that or not, but I hear a lot about really niche things. I see, as Charles said, that one unit or one subject with 300 students in it as an average of the research that we're seeing in these sorts of publications really makes me worry, because so many people, so many institutions are trying to put in that one-size-fits-all system. So how do we kind of bridge that gap as well? So there's so many more things I could go on about, but I wanted to throw a question back to the panel. And that was towards the end of the paper, they talk about whether or not our definition of learning analytics is right or fit for purpose for the moment. Do we need to rethink some of the approach of how we're trying to bring the field forward? But also, I agree with them. We do need more papers that look at that learning outcome as a thing. So we do need to redress that percentage, but as I said, I don't think it ever needs to be 100% the other way. But they said policy action is needed to align learning analytics better with its goals. And I'd like you to elaborate a little bit more on what do you think that policy action could be?
Yeah, I think that's great. So for me, a lot of it is about articulation. So that everything you said, I don't think I found any time I was disagreeing with anything you said, which was really wonderful. for me, it's a lot about articulation and understanding. And, if we looked at the dimensionality of what learning analytics is, and we used that as a definition, so if we moved away from such a small statement, that might be one way. That might be one, a set of inclusion criteria, if you will, for what is learning analytics and what isn't learning analytics, or what we would encourage people to go to our sister conferences, let's say, or journals or so forth, would be one way for it. I'm definitely not the kind of like, okay, you need an RCT or you're not in, right? Like most of my work wouldn't be in, even though I do RCTs. I do lots of non-RCT work as well. I do think that there's other things that we could do. For instance, we could encourage positionality statements. As some know, I'm really interested in open science, and we could encourage that to encourage people to adopt the methods and have something a little bit more generalizable, because you can now compare very clearly context, outcomes, data, instruments, and so forth, which we can't do with the vast majority of what we've got now. So these are the kinds of policy things, certainly, that are more in my mind, that are around that education aspect. And everyone here agrees with me. Yeah, so I think we're interested in hearing, though, from everybody here.
Get the answer straight up.
Wow. Wow. Quick draw.
I think Phil won.
All right, Phil. Yeah.
Do I get a prize? Do I get a red queen? Where's the butterfly? Come on.
Could you go back to the slide with the definition? The definition of learning analytics. Why did you read selectively? Because it mentions measurement, collection, analysis, reporting. Those words could have been M-blued, if that's a font styling, which would then make them eligible to consider with respect to the direction.
Oh. Yeah. I'm running.
So we could have I could have put the top things in bold. I mean, to me, the top part of that sentence is the stuff that we're doing. So we are collecting data, we are analysing it, we are reporting it. The bit we're not doing, to me, is the second half of that, and that, to me, that's the goal of what we should be trying to do. So yes, we're collecting the data, we're analysing it in a particular context, we're getting that bit right. But are we adding to our body of knowledge about learning, how learning happens and how we can optimise it?
If I get up the energy to write a commentary, I would ask, what's the proportion of work that should be allocated?
What's the proportion of our work that should be allocated to these different activities, one of which is what's in blue?
Just to save the other 70% of authors.
Yeah, pretty much to add up to the Phil point, it's not about learners, it's context, right? The context is the university, the context of the teachers, the adoption and all of that. So it's like having a definition of what is a car, saying car is, let's say, I don't know the definition, but, device for moving people from A to B, but the people doing research around cars are not talking about, they talk about the engines, about the chemicals and other things. So that's why I'm, to be honest, not surprised that it's 70%. I mean, maybe you can argue there's so many other things rather than just focus. That's the core loop of the system, improving learning. But there is all the other socio-technical elements of adoption, like Linda mentioned, and those things. Why there are small studies, I guess that could be, Sasha mentioned a few days ago on sustained effort, and goes to Linda what you were saying. But
if you go to the misalignment, your slide with misalignment, I don't see that's a misalignment at all. If you see that one, yeah, that's a part that I think it's strange. Why do you think that's a misalignment? If you go to that slide, you'll see what I mean about. So, can you just move it? Yes. Having learner-oriented goals, but researchers stuff around it, like cars have transportation goals, but researchers in car industry, they study chemicals or materials and steel, those sorts of things. They're not doing, like most people don't care about the transport in itself, right? So that's the point.
So I'm just going to respond because you used a car analogy and I'm from Michigan, so I feel like I should. The Detroit Auto Show is a big auto show, and well, the thing is they don't tell us about the new steel compounds that they use at the Detroit Auto Show. Well, so my question, so I'd love to hear a commentary on this. I'd love to see the commentary of this. What is it that we've learned about those contexts and those methods? And what is it we've contributed more than just demonstrating that you can use them in something with learning data? Like, it's not novel to just start applying a bunch of deep learning to a bunch of learning data instead of solar data or car data. If we can't at least tie it more clearly to learning outcomes, or if we're fine with that as a community, if that's something we're okay with, then let's get rid of maybe the bottom step part of the statement, that it has to be aimed at optimizing student learning, and it's more a demonstration of techniques, all of the stuff in the top.
I think I agree with the message of the paper, and I want to critique the framing, if you allow me. So I think we have a lack of direction as to what we're doing, but I don't think there's anything wrong with that, given that it's a new field and we're dealing with data sources that nobody else looks at. We're not quantitative and computational psychology, not neuroscience, we're something else. And so that brings me back to the question that Peter Ryman has asked many years ago, is like, what's so special about learning analytics? His answer was, well, you guys have to conceptualize what you're doing, you need a theory of sorts, but what it is you're looking at. And so coming from, I don't agree with what he proposed learning analytics should be, but my critique to the work that you have done comes from a place, have you been thinking enough outside of your own disciplines when you were approaching the work that you've been critiquing? Because you look at it in terms of intervention, outcome variable, perspective, but perhaps learning analytics shouldn't be looked at from these conceptual lenses. So for instance, I'd be interested in understanding what people believe is a theory of change in those papers. What are they trying to what are the leverage points people are pushing on, and what kind of things they think their interventions or whatever they're doing, it doesn't have to be, what are those indicators they're trying to capture? And if we can understand the theory of change, then we can start discussing what learning analytics, where can we have the impact? I think it's really ambitious to think that whatever it is we're doing can change learning. I mean, I'm not going to start on the discussion of what learning is, right? So I think thinking about what we're trying to do at a level that's outside of our disciplines. I mean, it's not enough to sit down and say, are we measuring this well? Is this the cause and effect? I'm struggling to formulate what I want to say, but I think what I'm hinting towards is that there is a lack of conceptual thinking about the field as a whole, because optimization and all of that stuff at the bottom of the definition, there's nothing wrong with that, but we don't spend enough time reflecting on what we mean by that with our own practice, not with the lenses that come from other domains. And I think we have something to offer, but we have to do hard work and sustained effort and all that, and it doesn't really always align with the conditions that we get. I don't know if it is fair what I'm saying or clear, but that's my 2 cents worth on that. Yeah.
So I don't want to hog the mic up here, panel, but I do want to respond. So the hardest thing for me with this was the title, A Lack of Direction, because it's aggressive, right? It makes it seem like we're failing to do something.
The language will address it quite a bit, Geraldine.
I actually thought the language in the paper was fairly written, so please feel free to write a response there. I mean, the intention here was measurement to compare to the definition, not to prescribe a result, so that was why it was very hand-wavy with we could do policy things, but also we could change definitions. So what do we want our community to be, and how do we, where's our form for discussing that? And now we have that one new dimension of that form. We have other dimensions that we can talk about this, right? You can kick off a Google Groups email about open science, and then a lot of people get excited too. But that's, we want to have these kinds of discussions. I don't actually disagree with you, I don't think, Sasha, and I think that there is, if people wanted me to articulate the difference between learning analytics, learning science, I don't know, is Ken still here? Learning engineering as a very new but fast-growing term, I would have a lot of troubles distinguishing between those. Maybe that's fine. I'm not sure though, and it stings when somebody says, oh, that's not learning analytics, and you disagree. And I've heard that at this conference in a presentation. And that's interesting, I think, too. Sorry.
Just kind of one question back, Sasha. So I'd agree that we do need an exploratory phase. And learning isn't easy to measure, and it's not easy to optimize. So that exploratory phase is likely to take a while. But at what point do we start saying we need to start making progress on the goal, and it's time to get more formal on the amount of exploration that we're tolerating or that we're allowed? You know, that percentage, I think, is of the studies that are ignoring learning is ignoring evidence of impact on learning.
It's about understanding the process of learning, not always the outcome.
How do you always learn?
Yeah.
You need to repeat the question if it's...
So the question is, it's about the process of learning, and yes, but as Rebecca, how do you know you're having an impact on process if you're not measuring?
Yeah. And here you go. But yeah. I think I was there for a while.
All right, Javier, it's your turn. Nah, we'll come back to you.
Okay, just first a comment. I think it's time to move out of that definition. If you see that definition is suspiciously similar to the definition of web analytics, if you go, web analytics is, yeah. So we need to move out of that. And more than just trying to come up with something new, it's, the idea is to think about how are we different. So if somebody asks you, what is the difference between learning analytics and traditional educational research? And I have here some answers of, oh, we use different data. Well, educational research also use log data. There's a lot of educational research that use that. It's because of our methods. But I think the objective is what is kind of different, is we are giving data back to stakeholders, not just focusing on publishing papers, publishing papers about how different people react to see data about their learning process. So this is just my personal definition, but I think we should move in this direction of let's have a 2024 definition of what learning analytics is that reflect what we have been doing and also our ideas, because I don't think we are not even close to those to reach what we started 11 years ago. So my question is how we can set up a process to come up with a new definition.
So Javier is going to write a commentary on the 2024 definition, and I think that's part of that. This, I hope, is part of that process of the definition. Let's talk, find some co-authors, pitch it. Who's next? Oh, we got an online person. That sounds so demeaning, but I don't know them. I don't know their name. Oh, the name's not even listed here. Well, it's just scrolled off the screen. Okay, is there a potential file drawer problem where these kinds of papers are rejected at LAK, as LAK proposals and could have achieved the aims, theory improvement, educational practices? It is possible that the community is conducting these studies, but they are excluded based on reviewers' heuristics and views of aims and scope. Absolutely, right? So then the question is, if they're not showing up in our scholarly proceedings, are they actually part of what we value as a community? I would argue no. Oh, I got a name, Matt Bernicki, thank you. I would argue no, and that's part of, like I said, my motivation. Somebody saying, oh, this isn't learning analytics, go send it to the learning sciences. And I'm like, I kind of feel like there's a 95% overlap at times. Anybody else want to speak to that?
Having just a comment on that. Grabbing this. So yeah, if they're not showing up in LAK or JLA, then I guess the next logical question is, where are they showing up? Like, where do we need to look towards other opportunities for stuff that gets rejected and things of that nature? Just a quick comment on that, and pass it back to you.
I got multiple fingers pointing me in places. Where are we going? We're really giving it back to Srečko? All right.
No, maybe we don't have to. But the thing is, I mean, the definition, right? It's not set in stone by any means, right? So if you go back, there was a paper published in Nature about cognitive sciences a few years back, and it says these are the 6 fields that define cognitive science, right? And this is how they evolved, how they came together to define cognitive science. The definition of learning analytics was not prescriptive by any means. So it was there to try to get field together and to drive the research that wasn't really traditional educational research at the time, because we had this pressure of adopting different learning management systems, different platforms, and collecting more data about learners, and there was a pressure using those data, right? But focusing just on the outcomes, I don't think it's really the main idea here, because if we build a predictive model to predict the outcome, how do we show impact there? So there is that translation into practice. There is, and learning analytics was always, at least to me, about process, about enabling assessment for learning, not assessment of learning, right? So that was always the goal. And I know I couldn't agree more that we have a lot of niche areas in the research. We started with social network analysis a long time ago. We built a lot of predictive models at the beginning. Then we brought the theory, we said, which makes perfect sense. Now the field is obviously advancing. But the reason why we still have a lot of those, we're bringing methods from other fields, we don't know which fields actually comprise learning analytics. Is that we know that there are methods from statistics, from computer science, from education, but there is no specified set of fields that define learning analytics as a field. And we draw from wherever we can to understand learning better. And we struggle. We struggle because we can't put those models back in practice. We can't reach our learners easily. We can't share data easily. And all those things are basically part of the research that has been published in learning analytics, not just studying the learning outcomes, right? But the reason why we still have a lot of methods brought to the field and why we are not building on each other's work is that we are not reading each other's work. Not as much as we should. And we did, Sasha and I and a few other colleagues, we are working on a data set that we would like everyone to analyze here. I don't think that we are giving each other enough credit. And I don't think the definition is the main problem, and just focusing on outcomes is basically just cutting off all those other things that need to put in place so that learning analytics can actually show the impact. We don't measure impact because we can't build, deploy, and assess the models and assess the impact of those. So that's why we need all the research across other areas. So that's, yeah, just a few points.
Are there folks who want to say, well, do you guys have a response of any kind? So Javier, I heard at the beginning that that definition is not my definition, but then I heard at the end, but the definition is not the problem. So while I think
Well, it's not my definition, I agree.
Well, I agree actually with what you said, Srečko. So where am I going?
Thank you. I really appreciate panel put together such a thought-provoking discussion and paper. So I think, if I understand correctly, when you pose this question, you make assumption of what learning analytics is. Remind ourselves of Pascal's quadrant, right? Use inspired research, fundamental research, and applied research. I think when you put together this question, you assume learning analytics is a use-inspired research. You try to solve a problem. Is that what you have in mind, I guess? But when you look at the paper presented in LAK community, you'll see a wider range of studies. Some of them actually answer very fundamental questions about learning, like Ken's talk and a lot of learning scientists in this room. So I would like to think about a more diverse view about learning analytics, define how we define ourselves, what kind of discipline, what kind of science it is. Another point I want to mention is whether we can borrow the idea from other disciplines. I remember Simon put a new paper on compare learning analytics with the framework of HCI. That gives you a perspective how learning analytics can evolve as a field, and with reference to some relatively more mature field, HCI. And I myself do research in healthcare, and there's a similar community called medical informatics. And if you look at the kind of work they do, it covers a wide range of research, some are more fundamental, some are more applied, some are somewhere in between. And it's quite inclusive, I would say. And we don't have a well-defined, I haven't seen people ask the question whether you need to have all this question be answered in a single paper. I feel like a bit too much to ask people to have all the question answered in a single paper. That's come to another comment, is that whether this is the correct unit of analysis for the analysis. Is it too much? Do you have a chance to look at a cluster paper? They answer the question sequentially, and first of all do some descriptive analysis, and then do some predictive analysis, and then you do the prescriptive analysis, and this is really a full workflow of the analytics pipeline. And another thing I want to mention is about the role of practitioner. I actually have a colleague, and he interestingly described himself a refugee of LAK. And they ended up created their own community of learning analytics practitioners. Actually, Joshua Quick is actually part of it. It's hosted at Indiana University. I participated in that conference. It's pretty interesting. And how we define ourselves is just our academic researcher, or we want to very heavily engage our practitioner as well. And this relates to the HCI, the paper that Simon wrote. It's about it. Some part of it is about the implementation science. How do you get there's a different story when your tool created in the lab versus the tool you use in the wild. I think this is an area relatively understudied, and yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Wow, you said lots of things. And the one thing that I'll just say is I also have a colleague who is not here this year at LAK and has been to LAK in the past, and says he doesn't feel it's his community because he studies learning.
Thanks. I wanted to comment on two things. One, well, first, I want to say I agree with a lot of the comments that have been made. Another is that I have found it interesting that in all of these discussions you're forgetting the third letter of LAK. So this conference is not just learning analytics. It's learning analytics and knowledge. And it's about understanding learning, understanding educational context, understanding learners. And so that, for me, has always been important. The other thing is resonating with the previous comment that when I read this paper a while ago, when it was in progress, I thought I liked it because it documents what's being done at a conference, but that doesn't document what's being done in the field or by us. So I would never submit an RCT to here. It would not even occur to me. And I would never submit, you can't, in the pathway of research, in development, in developing learning analytics to understand something that there's 20 years of research on communication dialogue. And so we did an analysis that was rejected by LAK on creating algorithms to detect the communication styles. Now, it was rejected for many reasons, but it had no learning outcome, because why would we? It's documented. The aspects that we were trying to detect have been documented. So that loop of going from analysis and understanding and development and then to application to action in a real learning environment is long. Like, think about IES funding. You don't have all of you get 1.4 million to develop a thing. You don't have to do research, big research. You get another 1.4 to do exploration. You do another 1.4 to do scale up. So to think that you could put all of that in a 6-page paper, I think is just absurd. But I do love the paper. Because it documents what's at this conference. But at a different granular level, we can document what the people are doing. So what have we published at AIED, AERA, EDM, or in actual journals, where you can tell more of the story. Oh, that sounded bad. Yeah, it really did. Anyway, in bigger venues of documentation. So those were my 2 points. It didn't sound like 2, but it was.
No, that sounded like 2 Danielle points to me. Yeah,
You've got one more here, but you want to wrap up?
Yeah. Okay, sorry, you want? I'm moderating my own panel here, where I'm running around trying to find things. Leah McFadden. Okay. I wonder if this is really simply the practitioner problem restated. My feeling is that the field emerged and has been rightly read by researchers. But for most of the decade, the practitioner community have been asking for greater inclusion and more application. And I think, Linda, you've spoken some to that. Do you want to further speak to that?
Firstly, hi Leah, we miss you. Yeah, totally agree. I really do think it's something that we do need to think about, is how do we bring the practitioner into this conversation. I am overawed about the people that I meet at this conference every year who do these amazing lab studies and really complex analyses and that sort of thing. And I think these people are wonderful. We need them. They're the basis of what we know about learning analytics and the processes and methodologies. But then how do we translate that into practice? How do we actually do it so that the teachers, the students, I like that idea before about the definition needs to be about that feedback that we give back to people through the work that we do in learning analytics. So how do we bring those people around the table? When I sit there and I look at researching learning analytics in my institution, I think I need to be collaborating more with people across the institution who are at the coalface, who are doing these sorts of learning, building these learning environments for students. So I think that, definitely getting practitioners involved is really important. And it was something I was thinking about actually as you were just speaking there. Part of, I think, the solution to this is making sure that at conferences like LAK we do already have practitioner tracks and those sorts of things, but they're pretty small. So how do we encourage people to engage in that more? I think what Rebecca's doing this has been a fantastic discussion, but the idea of having these sort of provocative papers that can generate this kind of debate and discussion amongst the community, I think is a really great first step. But is there, putting my editor's hat on, because I edit the Australasian Journal of Educational Technology, and we're having exactly the same conversation for our community of educational technology in Australia. How can we use things like the journal to create other opportunities to get things out there, to have, put points out there and have people debate about it? Papers that aren't just the traditional background, methods, findings, discussion. How can we do that? And I know it's risky because of impact factors and things like that. We don't want to mess around with that stuff too much, but we want to encourage the community. And I think LAK's such a great community for encouraging young talent. How can we use these mechanisms to do that further?
Thanks very much, Linda. I'm aware that there were people waving arms around. I think there's also people online who had questions. I think it's been a really great debate, a really great panel. I'm really thankful to these authors for coming together, for writing this paper, and for proposing this sort of section. What I'm asking all of you to do, you've probably all been thinking about, I've got a response to this, I've got thoughts on this, I would really like to say something. Put something into the journal, right? Responses can be up to 1,000 words. So if you've only got something short to say something short. If you've got something a bit longer to say something a bit longer. But there have been so many great points raised here, which sort of go to the heart of what our community is, what we think we're doing, where we think we're going, what we're doing elsewhere in other contexts. Really fabulous. Was there anything you wanted to say as a wrap-up?
I wouldn't want to frame this as a debate, but a discussion. And this is an amazing new instrument that we have now in the society for that discussion. And so we just grounded some data in the last couple of years of LAK, last couple of years of JLA. So let's have that discussion through this cool new instrument.
And thank you very much. Thank you to everybody involved.